The storm came fast, rolling across the New Mexico plains like a living beast clawing at the sky with lightning and sand. The world turned to dust and wind, swallowing the trail, the wagon, and every sound of reason. Clara Matthews gripped the side of the broken stagecoach, coughing, her eyes stinging as the driver's shouts vanished into the roar. One moment she'd been dreaming of California and clean starts. The next, her world was spinning into chaos. When the wheels cracked against the stones and the coach tipped, she was thrown into the earth with a violent jolt. The storm screamed over her, blinding and merciless. She crawled toward what she thought was shelter, the dark shape of a rock formation, and prayed someone might still be alive. That's when she saw him. At first, she thought he was part of the desert, a tall, motionless figure carved from shadow and stone. He stood above her, wrapped in a blanket patterned with thunderbirds, his hair braided with beads that glinted even through the storm. His eyes, dark as obsidian, watched her without flinching. "Get up," he said, his voice low, almost drowned by the wind. Something in his tone, not cruelty, but command, made her obey before she even thought about it. Her legs trembled, but she rose, brushing dust from her torn skirt. "There's no one else," she rasped. "The others," he didn't answer. Instead, he moved closer, studying her face as though trying to decide if she was real. Then wordlessly, he lifted her into his arms. She tried to protest, but the exhaustion stole her breath. He carried her toward the shelter of the rocks, moving with quiet strength, every step steady despite the storm's fury. When he finally set her down inside a small cave, she could see him more clearly. His skin was bronzed by sun and battle, his jawline sharp, his expression unreadable. The moment their eyes met, she felt the wildness in him, a quiet power that wasn't born of cruelty, but of survival. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "I didn't plan to crash a coach in the middle of nowhere," she managed, clutching her shawl tighter. "You're on Apache land," he interrupted. "My land." His words were not a threat, but a warning, one that seemed to carry the echo of years of blood and betrayal. Still, something in the storm came down the mountain like a beast, roaring through the canyons and filling the desert air with grit so thick Clara could hardly breathe. Her skirts clung to her legs, torn from the fall, and her palms were raw from clawing at the rocky slope. Somewhere behind her, the remains of the stagecoach lay half buried in sand. The driver was gone, swallowed by the storm, or worse. Cale moved ahead of her, his tall form cutting a path through the wind as if the desert itself obeyed him. His dark hair whipped across his shoulders, and the fringes of his buckskin jacket snapped like whips in the gale. He didn't look back often, but when he did, his eyes, hard and sharp as obsidian, measured her strength. He said little, only, "Stay close. The storm will break bones if it doesn't break spirit." Clara wasn't sure which was more dangerous, the wind or the man leading her through it. Every time she stumbled, he was there, steady and solid, catching her by the arm before she could fall again. His touch was rough, calloused, but careful. When she protested she could walk alone, his lips twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. "Then walk," he said, "but not behind. The desert eats the slow ones." By the time they reached the caves, the light was gone. Cale ducked beneath a shelf of stone, gesturing her inside. The air was cooler there, still carrying the scent of dust and rain, but at least it was still. She collapsed onto the sand floor, lungs burning. When she looked up, Kyle was already at work, striking flint, building a fire from dried brush and small twigs he'd carried in a pouch. Within minutes, a small flame glowed between them, painting his face in amber light. "Why help me?" she asked, her voice small against the hiss of the storm outside. He looked up slowly. "You were breathing, that's all?" "That's enough." There was something in the way he said it that silenced her. She wrapped her arms around her knees, trying to stop the shaking that wasn't entirely from cold. The fire grew stronger, throwing light across the cave walls, painted with old markings she didn't understand. Cale's gaze followed hers. "My mother's people sheltered here long ago," he said quietly. "When soldiers came, they hid the children in caves like this. Sometimes they survived." She heard the weight in his words and knew better than to press further. Instead, she watched him work, a man of few movements, all of them deliberate. He tore strips from his own sleeve to wrap her bleeding hands. She wanted to tell him she could manage, but when his fingers brushed her skin, she lost her nerve. Outside, thunder rolled across the desert, low and long. Inside, time seemed to hold its breath. "You shouldn't have come this way," Cale said at last. "No one crosses Apache land alone." I wasn't alone, Clara answered bitterly. There was a promise of an escort from Fort Stanton. They never came, he gave a dry laugh, humorless, sharp. The Army's promises are wind. Then his expression softened just slightly. You'll rest. When the storm ends, I'll take you to the river trail. And then? Then you go where you meant to go before the desert found you. She studied him through the flickering light. And you? What do you do when the desert finds you? He met her eyes, and for a heartbeat she saw something raw beneath his guarded calm, something lonely and unhealed. I live with it, he said simply. The firelight crackled between them. Outside, the wind began to fade, replaced by the rhythm of distant rain. Clara leaned back against the stone wall, exhaustion pulling her under. Before her eyes closed, she saw Cale sitting watch near the mouth of the cave, one hand resting on the knife at his belt, his silhouette fierce and silent against the storm. For the first time in months, she felt safe, and for reasons she couldn't name, she wanted morning to come slowly. The storm had passed, leaving the desert washed in silver light. Dawn spilled across the cliffs, casting long shadows over the sand, the rocks, and the cave where Clara and Cale had spent the night. The air smelled of wet earth and sage, and every sound, the distant caw of a crow, the whisper of wind over the canyon, felt sharper, more alive. Clara rubbed her eyes, still stiff from the night, and sat up. Cale was already awake, crouched by the fire's dying embers, his dark eyes scanning the horizon. You move like the wind, she said softly, testing the quiet between them. He didn't turn at first. When he did, there was a hint of amusement tugging at his jaw. The desert teaches quickly, he said. Those who hesitate get left behind. She stood slowly, brushing sand from her skirts, and for the first time she really looked at him. Cale was larger than she had realized, broad-shouldered, with arms strong from years of living against the land. There was something in his presence that made the air feel charged, as though the canyon itself held its breath when he moved. "Let me help," she said, reaching for a piece of dried meat he had placed near the fire. "I can carry it," He shook his head, but not harshly. Careful hands are rare here, he said. Most women would break their fingers before they could lift more than a loaf of bread. Clara's lips curved in the faintest smile. I've lifted more than bread in my life. He studied her for a long moment, the intensity in his gaze making her pulse quicken. Finally, he sighed, a sound that carried both resignation and curiosity. Fine, but watch the rocks, he warned, gesturing toward the narrow path they would take to reach the river trail. One slip and the canyon keeps you forever. They moved out together, the desert light illuminating every detail. Clara followed Cale closely, learning to place her feet where he did, to move with the careful precision of someone who knew the land like it was part of their body. When a rattlesnake slithered across their path, Cale's hand shot out, gripping her elbow and pulling her back just in time. Her heart raced, not from fear but from the heat of his nearness. The power coiled in his body that both terrified and thrilled her. You're reckless, he said, his voice low, almost a growl. And you're fast, she countered, holding his gaze unafraid. For a moment, the canyon echoed only their breathing and the faint rattle of the snake retreating. In that pause, Clara realized something. This man, rough, untamed, and dangerous, was not merely a protector. He was a force, a storm she had not anticipated and yet one she wanted to face head-on. By mid-morning, they reached a small creek, its waters sparkling like molten silver. Cale knelt and drank deeply, then gestured for her to do the same. When she bent, their shoulders brushed and a spark of warmth passed between them, not just from the sun but from proximity, from the tension neither had yet named. She looked up at him, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something softer beneath his guarded exterior. You move well, he said, almost reluctantly. You taught me, she replied. He shook his head, a faint laugh escaping him this time. Not many learn this quickly. Clara felt pride and exhilaration, but also a deeper, more complicated emotion. There was fire here, between them in the desert, in the way he looked at her, and it scared her even as it drew her closer. She realized that surviving the storm outside was nothing compared to surviving the storm he brought into her heart. As they followed the creek toward the river trail, Clara found herself walking taller, shoulders squared. Cale's presence was commanding, yet somehow she felt no fear, not when she was beside him. And when he glanced back, his eyes locking with hers, there was an unspoken acknowledgement. They were partners now, bound by the storm, by the desert, and by the spark that neither could ignore. By the time they stopped for a brief rest, the fire between them, the one that had begun with mutual respect, caution and shared danger, burned brighter than either had expected. And Clara knew that the journey ahead would be as treacherous as it was thrilling, for the desert was wild and Kyle was even wilder. The sun hung high over the canyon, baking the sand and rocks until the air shimmered with heat. Clara and Cale moved carefully along the narrow ridge that led to the river trail, their shadows stretching long and thin behind them. The storm had passed, but the desert still carried dangers, hidden snakes, treacherous footing, and eyes that might belong to men with ill intentions. Kyle walked just ahead, scanning the horizon, hand never far from the knife at his belt. Clara followed closely, learning the rhythm of his movements, the subtle shifts in weight that told her when danger might be near. Don't look down, he warned suddenly. And she realized she had been watching her steps so intently that she hadn't noticed the cliffside falling away just to her right. Her heart pounded as she kept pace, but she refused to show fear. I'm not fragile, she said, more to herself than to him. No one said you were, Cale replied, voice low, almost a growl. But the desert doesn't care about pride. One wrong step and it doesn't matter how strong you think you are. The path widened briefly, giving them a moment of relief. Clara finally allowed herself to breathe deeply, feeling the warmth of the sun and the exhilaration of having survived the worst of the cliffs. But her reprieve was short-lived. From the scrub below came the crack of a rifle, sharp and sudden, echoing through the canyon. Cale's body moved instinctively, pulling her low behind a boulder as another shot rang out. They're close, he hissed, eyes dark and calculating. Move with me and don't make a sound. Clara felt the heat of his body behind her, the taut strength in his arms as he guided her through the rocks. She had faced fear before, but never like this. Not the kind that demanded complete trust, that forced her to rely on another's judgment entirely. Her pulse raced, yet she followed him without question, her hands gripping his arm when she needed balance, her eyes never leaving his. They ducked into a narrow alcove, hidden from the sight of their attackers. Cale crouched beside her, pressing a finger to his lips. "You're learning fast," he said. Most would freeze. Most would scream, "You!" His eyes softened briefly. "You're different." Clara met his gaze, searching for meaning, but found only the raw intensity she had seen from the start. "I'm not trying to be different," she whispered. "I'm trying to survive." "You survive differently than most," he admitted. "You take risks most won't. That makes you dangerous in your own way." Dangerous. The word hung in the air, charged with unspoken tension. Clara felt it stir something within her, a mix of thrill, fear, and something darker, something magnetic that drew her closer to him even in the midst of chaos. Cale motioned for her to move again. They slipped from alcove to alcove, rocks shielding them from the rifle fire. Each step demanded perfect timing and absolute trust. Clara realized she was no longer just following him. She was matching him, reading his body as if they had been moving together for years. She felt a strange pride, tempered by adrenaline, as they finally reached a stretch of open ground where Cale signaled her to stop. He glanced around, his jaw tight, before kneeling and examining her briefly. "You trust me," he said quietly. "I do," Clara replied without hesitation. His eyes locked on hers, searching, measuring. "Good. You will need that trust," he said. "Out here, trust is the difference between life and death, between surviving and losing yourself." Clara swallowed, her chest tight but her heart steady. She understood. This was more than physical danger. It was a test of their connection, their instincts, their willingness to rely on one another. And as they crouched in silence, listening to the retreat of their pursuers, she felt something shift inside her. She had faced storms, cliffs, and bullets, but this, the need to trust someone completely, was proving to be the hardest and most exhilarating challenge of all. Kyle extended a hand to help her stand. She took it without hesitation, feeling the strength in his grip, the unwavering assurance that he would not let her fall. And for the first time since she had arrived in the desert, Clara believed, not just in her own strength, but in the bond forming between them, forged in fire, fear, and trust. The desert lay quiet for a moment, but Clara knew it was only a pause. The sun had climbed higher, burning through the early haze, and the trail ahead shimmered with heat. Dust rose from the tracks behind them, too regular, too deliberate to be just wind. Cale's eyes narrowed, scanning the horizon with a predator's focus. "They're coming," he said simply, voice low, tense. "More than one." Clara felt her pulse quicken, but this time it wasn't just fear, it was exhilaration. She had faced the storm, the cliffs, even the hidden dangers of rattlesnakes, and yet now, standing beside Cale, the real threat seemed almost manageable. Almost. Cale shifted, his hand hovering over the hilt of his knife. "We need to move carefully. Stay close." They advanced slowly, stepping between rocks and low shrubs, keeping to shadows and uneven ground. Clara noticed how every movement Cale made was precise, deliberate, like a dance he had rehearsed countless times. She mimicked him instinctively, learning not just how to survive, but how to move as one with him. Suddenly, a voice called out from the ridge above, a harsh, commanding tone that carried across the canyon. "Apache, step out and surrender." Cale's jaw tightened. "Cowards," he muttered. "They think numbers matter." Clara's heart pounded in her chest. She had never seen Cale like this, not cautious, not even tense, but coiled like a panther ready to spring. And yet, despite the danger, there was a strange exhilaration in watching him move with such certainty. The first of the attackers appeared, a soldier, rifle raised. Cale reacted instantly, spinning behind a boulder, motioning for Clara to do the same. His hand was firm on her shoulder as he guided her to cover. She froze for a heartbeat, realizing the full weight of their vulnerability, then obeyed without hesitation. "Trust me," he said, his voice low but commanding. "I do." she whispered. The soldiers advanced, their boots crunching against rock and sand. Cale's knife flashed in the sunlight as he deflected an attack from one of the men, his movements fluid, precise. Clara watched, caught between fear and awe, as he moved through the attackers like water flowing around stones. Then a soldier lunged toward her. Instinctively, Cale's hand shot out, catching her by the arm and pulling her behind him. The close proximity sent a jolt of heat through her chest, more intense than any fear or adrenaline. She realized with startling clarity how much she relied on him, not just for protection, but for the certainty that he would not let her falter. The skirmish was brief, but intense. Rocks and dust flew as Cale disarmed two men, forcing the rest to retreat. Clara's chest heaved with exertion, her hands shaking as she realized she had survived. Because of him. Because with him she was more than just herself. When the dust finally settled, Cale and Clara stood in silence, surveying the retreating soldiers. Cale's eyes softened briefly as he glanced at her. "You did well," he said quietly. "Better than I expected." Clara felt a strange warmth spread through her chest. She had faced enemies before, but never like this. Not side by side with someone who seemed to anticipate every move, who made her feel capable, alive, and wanted. "Couldn't have done it without you," she admitted, her voice steady now. He shook his head, a faint, almost imperceptible smile tugging at his lips. "Don't be foolish. You did it because you had to. Because you wanted to survive. That's what matters." They stood together for a moment longer, the desert silent once more, except for the distant echo of hooves fading away. Clara realized that something had changed between them. The storm, the cliffs, the danger. They had forged a bond stronger than fear, stronger than respect, stronger than either of them had expected. Cale finally turned his gaze to the horizon. "We keep moving," he said. "The river trail isn't far. But be ready. The desert isn't done testing us yet." Clara nodded, feeling the thrill of what had passed and the anticipation of what was to come. She had faced bullets, dust, and danger, and had emerged stronger. Beside Cale, she felt like she could face anything, as long as he was by her side. The desert stretched ahead, vast, untamed, and merciless. But for the first time, Clara did not feel small in its shadow. She had found an ally, a protector, a force to match her own stubborn fire, and she knew, deep in her heart, that whatever came next, they would face it together. The desert night fell with a quiet intensity, wrapping the canyon in a cool, silver hush. Stars spilled across the sky, sharp and distant, while the wind whispered through the jagged rocks like secrets carried from the mountains. Clara and Cale had made camp near the river trail, a narrow stretch of water glinting under the moonlight. The fight from earlier in the day had left them both drained but alert, every muscle still taut with adrenaline. Cale knelt by the fire, arranging small branches with a care that surprised Clara. His movements were deliberate, precise, a quiet ritual that seemed to soothe both him and the desert around them. She watched him for a long moment, noting the way the firelight caught the planes of his face, the sharpness of his cheekbones, the darkness in his eyes, the slight tension in his jaw. There was danger in him, yes, but also a raw humanity she hadn't expected to find. "You've been quiet," Cale said without looking up. His voice carried across the small clearing, low but not unkind. "I'm thinking," Clara replied softly, "about the day, about everything." He glanced at her then, eyes dark, unreadable. "Do you ever wonder why the desert tests us so?" "I suppose," she said, "it's to show us what we're made of." "Or who we're made for," he added, and the words hung in the air between them, charged and weighty. Clara's heart skipped a beat. She didn't know what he meant exactly, but the way he said it, so quietly, so assuredly, made it impossible to ignore. They sat by the fire in silence for a while, the desert stretching endlessly around them. Clara thought about her life before the storm, before the cliffs, before Cale. She had known fear, loneliness, loss, but never this sense of connection, this sense of being seen. And yet, beneath the quiet comfort, there was a tension, an unspoken electricity that made the air between them almost unbearable. Cale finally broke the silence. "You're different," he said, voice rough but thoughtful. "Most people I meet are cautious, afraid. You're not." "I've had to survive," she replied, meeting his gaze. And I've had to face things alone. He studied her, the firelight reflecting in his eyes. And yet here you are, he said softly. Facing the desert, facing danger, standing beside me. Clara felt her chest tighten, emotions she didn't quite understand pressing forward. I trust you, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. More than anyone I've ever met. Cale's expression softened, and for a brief moment the hardness in his eyes faded. Good, he said simply. Because trust is all we have out here. The desert doesn't forgive mistakes, and it doesn't forgive doubt. They sat closer together as the night deepened, the warmth of the fire between them mirrored by a growing warmth in their hearts. Neither spoke for a long time, content in the unspoken bond forming between them. It was not yet love, not yet confession, but something deeper, something raw, urgent, and undeniable. Finally, Cale leaned back against a rock, eyes scanning the horizon. You survived the storm today, he said quietly, almost to himself. Not just the desert, but everything it threw at you. That makes you remarkable. Clara's lips curved in a faint, tired smile. And you, she said, are relentless. But maybe that's why we fit. He met her gaze then, and for a moment the desert faded, leaving only the fire, the stars, and the quiet intensity between them. No words were needed. The promise was there, unspoken but understood. They would face whatever came next together, not just as allies in the desert, but as something more, something neither had dared to name, yet both could feel. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of sage and earth, and Clara closed her eyes, leaning slightly toward him. For the first time in months she felt a sense of peace, not a false comfort, not a fleeting calm, but a quiet certainty that wherever the desert led, they would meet it side by side. The night stretched on, silent but full, and in that silence the unspoken promise between them grew stronger, binding them together in ways neither could yet fully articulate, but both understood perfectly. The dawn arrived pale and fragile over the canyon, brushing the desert with soft streaks of gold. Clara stirred first, the cold biting her fingers as she wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Cale lay beside the fire, eyes half closed, listening to the faint sounds of the desert waking. For a moment everything felt calm, almost peaceful. Too calm. And then came the thunder of hooves, harsh and deliberate, echoing against the cliffs. Clara's stomach knotted. Cavalry uniforms glinted in the morning sun as soldiers poured into the clearing, surrounding their camp with precision. Cale was instantly alert, rolling to his feet with the grace of a predator. Apache, one officer shouted, spurring his horse closer. Surrender now or we fire. Clara's heart raced, but she didn't move. The soldiers' rifles were trained on Cale, but she saw the hesitation in their eyes. They had underestimated him, or perhaps underestimated her. Without thinking, Clara stepped forward, arms raised, voice steady and clear. He isn't your enemy. You're wrong. He saved lives today. Her words echoed across the canyon, surprising even her own resolve. Cale's eyes flicked to her, a mixture of surprise and admiration. She had never seen him caught off guard, and yet there he was, watching her defend him. Step back, the officer barked, but Clara refused. I won't, she shouted. He is no criminal. He fought for survival and for protection. Do you not see that? The soldiers faltered, exchanging uneasy glances. Cale moved silently beside her, never touching her but letting her courage stand as a shield between him and the rifles. The moment was tense, brittle like a knife edge stretched across the canyon. Finally, Cale's voice broke through the silence. She speaks the truth, he said, calm but commanding. I defend those who cannot defend themselves. Today I saved her life, and she has saved mine by standing here. The officer hesitated, the weight of Cale's words hanging heavier than the threat of violence. Clara noticed Cale's hand brushing against hers ever so slightly. Not to touch, but to anchor her in the moment. That simple, almost imperceptible gesture sent a jolt through her chest. After a long pause, the officer finally signaled for the rifles to lower. Move on, he said reluctantly. But this doesn't end here, Apache. The law will find you. Cale's eyes never left Clara as the soldiers rode away. He finally exhaled, tension leaving his body in a slow, deliberate sweep. He studied her for a long moment, and Clara realized with a sudden clarity what had just happened. She had risked everything, her safety, her life, to protect him. And in doing so, she had crossed a line they could not ignore. They were no longer merely companions or allies. "You were reckless," Kyle said quietly, voice low yet soft in a way that made her heart flutter. "And you were too cautious," she replied, daring a small smile. He shook his head almost in disbelief. "You would stand in front of rifles for me," he murmured. "That means something." Clara's lips curved in a faint smile. "It means I trust you, that I believe in you, that I won't let anyone or anything take that away from us." Kyle's expression softened, the hard edges of his face melting into something warmer, almost tender. He reached out, brushing a loose strand of hair from her cheek. "You've changed me," he admitted, voice husky. "You've made me believe that maybe there's more than survival out here, that there's connection." Clara felt heat rise in her chest. The desert had tested them, pushed them to their limits, and now, in the quiet aftermath of danger, something unspoken passed between them. Something real, something inevitable. She stepped closer, feeling the space between them shrink until there was nothing left but the silent acknowledgement of what had grown in the desert. Courage, trust, and a bond that neither could deny. The river sparkled nearby, the morning sun painting it in shades of gold and silver, and in that moment Clara knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, she and Cale were no longer two separate souls. They were bound, captured not by rifles or law, but by something infinitely more powerful, each other's hearts. The morning air was crisp as Cale and Clara mounted their horses, the river trail stretching ahead like a silver ribbon winding through the desert. After the encounter with the cavalry, the urgency to move was palpable. Every step they took carried them further from the danger, but also deeper into uncharted territory, the wild heart of the desert where only the brave, or the reckless, survived. Kyle rode slightly ahead, glancing back frequently to make sure Clara was keeping pace. His eyes, dark and unreadable, softened when they met hers, a silent acknowledgement of the trust they now shared. She had saved him with her courage, and in turn, he was carrying her forward through the wilderness, each of them reliant on the other. The terrain was rugged, dotted with sharp rocks and unexpected drops, and Clara quickly realized that survival required more than skill. It required instinct, attentiveness, and a certain recklessness tempered with caution. Kyle seemed to know every step before it came, reading the land as if it were an extension of himself. Clara followed, learning, adapting, discovering an unexpected confidence growing within her. "You've learned quickly," Kyle remarked, glancing back with a rare smile as she guided her horse over a precarious ridge. "I've had a good teacher," she replied, her tone light, though her muscles ached from the ride. They rode in silence for a while, the only sound the clatter of hooves on stone and the distant call of a hawk. Clara's mind wandered to the events of the past days, the storm, the cliffs, the ambush, and the way Cale had protected her. She had survived fear and, in the process, discovered something she hadn't anticipated, a growing bond with the man she had once feared, a connection forged in the crucible of danger. At midday they paused by a small outcropping, the shade of jagged rocks providing relief from the scorching sun. Cale dismounted first, moving to tie the horses to a nearby boulder. Clara followed, brushing dust from her skirt, feeling the heat of the day and the strength of her own pulse. "You've changed," he said quietly, almost to himself as he regarded her. "You're no longer the woman who arrived on the stagecoach, terrified and unsure. You're stronger, sharper, alive in ways that few survive." Clara's heart fluttered at his words. "The desert teaches," she said softly. "And you've shown me how to survive it." Cale's gaze lingered, steady and intense. "Not just survive," he said, "thrive. You've learned to move like the desert, fight like it, and trust like it, and that makes you rare." For a moment, the world seemed to shrink to the two of them. The heat of the sun, the sparkle of the river below, the endless horizon beyond. Clara felt a rush of emotion, gratitude, admiration, something deeper that she had not fully named. She realized how much she relied on him, how much she had come to trust him, not just for survival, but for the steadiness he brought to her heart. Kyle noticed the subtle change, the way her eyes softened, the quiet strength in her posture. He reached out instinctively, brushing a hand across her arm in reassurance, not a touch of passion, but a grounding presence that said, without words. I am here. You are safe. Together, we are stronger. They rode on, the desert unfolding endlessly before them, every ridge and canyon a test, every twist in the trail an opportunity to rely on each other. The journey was far from over, but Clara felt a new certainty, a growing confidence that whatever trials lay ahead, they would face them side by side. The river trail wound further into the mountains, shimmering in the sunlight like a promise of hope and sanctuary. Clara's pulse matched the rhythm of the horse's hooves, and for the first time in days she allowed herself to relax into the moment. They had escaped immediate danger, but more importantly, they had discovered something far greater. A bond forged in trust, courage, and mutual respect. A bond that neither the desert nor the world could easily break. As the sun dipped lower, painting the canyon walls in gold and crimson, Clara glanced at it. The morning sun spilled over the canyon walls like molten gold, illuminating the river that curved lazily through the valley. Clara awoke to the gentle ripple of water and the distant cry of a hawk. She stretched, feeling the tightness of muscles from the ride, but also a warmth that had nothing to do with the sun. Cale was already awake, tending to the horses with a careful, practiced hand. He glanced up as she rose, his dark eyes meeting hers for a brief moment, and something unspoken passed between them. An acknowledgement of the trials they had faced, together, and of the bond that had grown stronger with each challenge. Clara dressed quickly, brushing sand from her skirts, and approached the river. The water was cool and clear, offering a refreshing contrast to the sun-baked desert. Kyle followed, kneeling to drink, and she noticed the way his muscles shifted under his skin as he moved, strength and grace combined. She realized again how deeply she admired him, not just for his skill and courage, but for the calm authority he carried even in moments of danger. "You're up early," Cale remarked, his voice low but teasing. "I couldn't sleep," she admitted. "Too much on my mind, and maybe too much adrenaline." He studied her for a moment as though weighing whether to say something, then shook his head with a small, wry smile. "The desert leaves its mark," he said softly. "But you've survived it. You're stronger than most I've known." Clara felt a warmth that had little to do with the sun. "I've had a good teacher," she said, voice quiet but sincere. Cale's gaze lingered on her, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The previous days, the storm, the cliffs, the ambush, the narrow escape from the cavalry, had all led to this quiet moment of understanding. They didn't need words to define what had grown between them. Trust, respect, something more profound, quietly burning beneath the surface. As they prepared a simple breakfast, Cale's hand brushed hers briefly, almost accidentally, but the contact sent a shiver through her. She caught his gaze, and he offered a faint, almost imperceptible smile, as if acknowledging the tension without breaking it. They ate in companionable silence, the sounds of the river and desert surrounding them. Clara's thoughts drifted to the journey ahead, but also to the small, private victories. The way Cale had allowed her to take part in decisions, the way he had relied on her instincts as much as she relied on his guidance. She realized that the desert had not only tested them, it had revealed their strengths, their vulnerabilities, and their capacity to trust one another fully. After breakfast, Cale stood and extended a hand to her. "Come," he said. "We'll continue along the river trail. There's a place ahead where my people once lived. A hidden valley. You should see it." Clara took his hand without hesitation, feeling the strength and steadiness in his grip. As they walked together toward the river, the sunlight glinting off the water, she felt an unexpected peace settle over her. The desert, once a place of fear and uncertainty, now felt like a space of belonging. Beside Cale, she was no longer a stranger to the wild, and she no longer felt fragile or alone. They reached a narrow bend in the river where wildflowers grew in delicate clusters. Cale paused, kneeling to examine the plants, and Clara watched him, noticing the care in his movements, the reverence he seemed to hold for even the smallest details of the land. She realized that this same care extended to her, his watchfulness, his protective instincts, his unspoken promise to stand by her. For the first time since her arrival in the desert, Clara felt the quiet certainty of something lasting, something beyond mere survival. She had faced storms, cliffs, enemies, and uncertainty, yet here she stood, beside a man she trusted completely, in a place that was slowly becoming home. Cale's eyes met hers, steady and intense. Without words, they acknowledged the bond between them, the promise they had forged in danger, trust, and shared experience. It was a promise neither needed to speak aloud, that they would face the desert together, whatever trials came next, and that their hearts had already found their refuge in each other. The morning stretched before them, golden and endless, and Clara felt a quiet thrill, both of freedom and of belonging. The desert had tested them, but it had also given them something precious, a connection neither time nor trial could undo. The sun dipped low over the river valley, casting long shadows across the desert floor and painting the cliffs in gold and crimson. Clara and Cale had ridden far that day, the trail twisting through hidden canyons and along narrow ridges that tested every ounce of their skill and courage. Yet despite the exhaustion that tugged at her muscles, Clara felt a thrill she had never known, an exhilaration born not just from surviving the wild, but from standing beside someone who matched her, challenged her, and made her feel fully alive. They came to a plateau overlooking the river, the water glinting silver in the fading light. Kyle dismounted first, holding his hand out to Clara. She met his gaze, the intensity in his dark eyes making her heart pound. "Are you sure you want to continue?" he asked, voice low and rough, carrying both warning and challenge. "I've never been more sure of anything," she replied, her voice steady, eyes bright with resolve. "I've faced storms, bullets, cliffs. I can face this, too." Kyle's lips curved in the faintest hint of a smile, and he studied her, for a long moment as if weighing her words against the measure of the desert itself. "You're reckless," he said finally, almost a growl, "and stubborn. Dangerous traits. And you?" Clara stepped closer, her gaze unwavering. "Are commanding, untamed, and relentless. You warned me, and I still came." There was a beat of silence, the kind of pause that seemed to stretch across time. Kyle stepped closer, the heat of the day lingering between them, the quiet strength of his presence pressing into her own. "I told you, I'm too much," he said, low and intense. "Too wild, too large, in ways you may not be ready for." Clara's breath caught, but she didn't flinch. She reached out, resting her hand lightly on his chest, feeling the solid warmth beneath his jacket. "I know," she whispered, "and I still want this. I trust you. Try me anyway." Kyle's eyes softened, and for the first time the barriers he had maintained began to slip. He saw the fire in her, the courage, the defiance, the willingness to face what others might shy away from, and something deep inside him stirred. He had survived years of battles, storms, and betrayals, but this was different. She wasn't afraid of him. She was ready. The desert wind swept through the plateau, tugging at Clara's hair and clothing, and the world seemed to narrow until there was nothing left but the two of them. He reached out, brushing a hand over her cheek, a touch tender, yet commanding. Her pulse raced, but she met him without hesitation. "You're fearless," he said softly, almost awed. "And I—" His voice caught, raw with emotion he rarely let show. He took her hand in his, holding it firmly, a promise in the gesture. "I'll meet you step by step if that's what you want." Clara's smile was quiet but radiant, full of certainty. "I do," she said. "I've never wanted anything more." For a long moment they simply stood there, hands entwined, gazing out over the river, the cliffs, the endless expanse of desert. The trials they had faced, the storm, the cliffs, the ambushes, the cavalry, had all led to this moment. And in the stillness of the valley beneath the fading sun, Clara realized that the bond between them was more than trust, more than survival.